Orland, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. How you doing?
Um, do we have Judy or Michelle from EPE or Rhonda? Anybody from or Leslie?
Not yet.
Okay. Um, so welcome. It's the 25th of March, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. This is Margie Tatro with my colleague Deborah Shields from GridWorks hosting a requested session of the New Mexico PRC Utility Division staff office hour. This was a request both based on Orland's request regarding the modeling run request, and then post the March 20th office hour where it was clear that PRC division staff had some additional questions through you, Cynthia. We are grateful that EPE and E3 agreed to have an office hour directly for PRC Utility Division staff. Steve, you're welcome to attend as an observer, but I would ask that because there have been other opportunities for the stakeholders in this process to have questions, that perhaps you are an observer and will rely on Judy Orland and Cynthia and any other PRC Utility Division staff to represent themselves in this conversation. Does that work for you, Orland?
Sounds good.
Steve, does that work for you?
Yep, sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, but we're trying to be really, really clear on process here so that there's not a problem in the future. Okay.
Thank you for your flexibility and sorry for the last minute. I didn't know this was happening. So,
Yeah.
but now I'll keep my mouth shut.
Okay, well, you're welcome as an observer. Thank you. And it looks like we have Emmanuel and Rhonda on as well.
Hello.
So, hi, Emmanuel. Hi, Rhonda.
Hi there. How's
Um,
everybody doing?
Good. Thank you for being here. We just did introduction. I don't have any structure for this session, so I would like to just remind the group that where we are in the stakeholder process is that there is 1 week from today for stakeholders to turn in modeling run requests. And this conversation was asked for by Orland prior to the March 20th stakeholder office hour on model run requests. And I know that Cynthia, you had some questions. So just recall that that's where we are in our process. Happy to have discussions about what kind of modeling run thoughts you might have, even if you're not ready with a request. I understand you have some questions about information. So I'm going to turn it over to Orland to begin. And Orland, I'll let you run the conversations, and Judy and Cynthia as well to ask questions. We've got the E3 and EPE team here, so please go ahead.
Hi,
So
good
yeah,
afternoon. I'm so sorry, Orland.
of
I
course, go
don't mean
ahead.
to interrupt. This is Judy Parsons, Margie, and staff. My apologies. My computer froze, so I needed to run over to another office. So it's me and Emmanuel here. So please, feel free to ask any questions if there's anything that we can help you all with. And I just, first and foremost, wanted to say thank you to everybody on the call today and allowing us the opportunity to answer your questions and work with you.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Judy. I'd like to ask, generally what we're interested in finding in this office hour is we'd like to understand in the past if if through all the IRPs, which is just a planning document for the utility, you've got forecasts. And in those forecasts, have you seen over time that you are seeing your operational realities get closer and closer to your forecasts? And can you clarify, maybe why or why not you've seen, or is that improving over time, or is that can someone dive in there a little bit? So you forecasted, for instance, a load. You say here's our expected loads, and I'd like to understand have you apportioned your generation kind of closer and closer to that? I know it's kind of you walk a line where you're either overbuilding or underbuilding. So I'd like to know, is that in a document somewhere that we can access to see, are you getting closer and closer to your forecasts? Is that process improving? We've been through several IRPs now, so I'd like to know.
I think there needs to be a little clarification or explanation on getting closer and closer to our forecast. Every forecast is inherently going to have some margin of error in terms of, is our load forecast team getting close to what actually manifests? Yes, they are, and every year they are getting better. It's just that in the last few years, we had a severe hot streak, extremely hot summer, which was unprecedented, that those weird weather events are hard for any model to capture. And secondly, the expansion of all these data centers and large load customers, it's not unique to El Paso. That's just across the country. So the AI boom or bubble, depending on who you ask, but it's everywhere, and it makes your forecast inherently look off, but it's another one of those things that came out of right field that now you need to start to account for.
So has that been documented anywhere? That, I mean, I know that these have been kind of sporadically discussed through maybe rate case filings and other dockets, but I'm curious if that has been kind of, do you have a report somewhere that will communicate, hey, we're getting closer and closer, except for these days we've missed those for the reasons that you just said. We're missing the mark sometimes because of unprecedented load growth or weather events. Is
We-
that where would the public access that?
We don't have a report or a white paper or anything specific to it, but there is, for example, a Texas CCN filing that's going on right now. It's being addressed in the current rate case. Am I forgetting anything?
No, and then Orland, we've also mentioned this in several workshops that we've had before the PRC. We've had market development workshops where, this has been addressed, at length for like the last 2 years. Emmanuel and I have been participating in those. And as Emmanuel said, it's not unique to EPE. PNM, SPS have, said the same thing. This is a very common topic that's being talked about, several conferences throughout the Southwest. It's been a huge topic of discussion at CREPC, which is a regulatory conference that has been going on the past 3 years. And that is the biggest point of discussion, is just resource adequacy, these large load customers that are interested in interconnecting and the impact that it'll have on the grid.
Okay. And to clarify, another question I've got, you all have your 2025 LNR tables. And I'd just like to know, can you all specify where the minimum critical load for those are? Essentially, what I'm trying to understand is, got, a 2025 LNR, are we talking about averages? Are we talking about minimum critical load? Are there maximums built in or baked into those? And those are things that I would like to understand.
Would you like me to take that one, Emmanuel?
Yeah, go for it.
So as we look through the loads and resources table, and let me just bring up what Rhonda sent me earlier, so we have a visual aid here. I have it somewhere. Rhonda, if you're on the line, are you able to quickly share that 25 loads and resources table? Do we have Rhonda?
Rhonda's on the line. I don't know if you're talking, Rhonda, you're on mute.
There
Yeah, I'm
she is.
sorry, I was on mute.
Okay.
Just one second, I'm bringing it up.
And I just wanted to mention also, I believe the individuals that did submit a contact information form should have access to the EPE SharePoint that's been set up. I will confirm that as soon as this call is over. But the 2025 LNR table that's being referenced is available in the SharePoint.
So just as Rhonda posed that up, Orlin, to answer your question, there's a kind of a couple of different approaches here. So as we look at the load forecast itself, the load forecast is a weather normalized kind of P50 forecast. So it is by no means kind of a maximum or a minimum, is what you expect on an average weather year. And to Emmanuel's point earlier, what we see happening, not just for EPE, but across the entire nation right now. Okay, perfect. It's coming up on the screen. Okay, so if we start down, if you don't mind just scrolling down to row 36, please, Rhonda, if you don't mind. Okay, perfect. So as we look at, or actually row 37, let me put my glasses on and I'll be able to do this a little bit better. Yeah, row 37. So as we look at this forecast here, this would be a weather normalized forecast. So this is essentially average weather year. And what we see across the nation right now is increased volatility in weather, whether that's Winter Storm Uri, Winter Storm Jerry, on the winter side, or as the EP experienced last year or the year before, extreme summer heat. So these load forecasts, again, kind of are an average, and it is not unusual. 50% of the time, you would expect your actual load to exceed these numbers. So that's kind of an average number. And then as we look at the accreditation that each resource receives, so if we now just scroll up, Rhonda, to the section above, and keep going, and we got to row 10 there, perfect. As we look at these accreditation values, these are probabilistic numbers. So these numbers are calculated using the effective load carrying capability studies. And in these cases, we run hundreds, if not 1,000 different simulations of generation, its output under different weather conditions, and we work out a probabilistic value for accredited capacity. So Orlin, to directly answer your question, from a resource perspective, it's probabilistic, and then from a load perspective, it's average.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. And I appreciate that you're diving into this a bit. So do you add like coincidence factors, or is that baked into your is that already baked into your models?
And when you say
Ben, can I just comment on the LNR? Since
Yeah,
this
please.
is 2025 and it's an operational year, we assume like a plan operating a reserve margin instead of a planning reserve margin. And when we assume an operating reserve margin, we don't apply ELCC to the generating units. If that makes
okay,
sense.
that's a good clarification. Thank you, Rhonda. So just to repeat that back, Orland, everything I just described is correct for the planning years 26 onwards. And then EP during the operational year, so just 2025, they make their adjustments on their operational year. But if we're talking about like a loads and resources table on a forward-looking projection, the probabilistic and the average ratings are correct.
I see. So in your 3P weather normalized LNR averages, are coincidence factors applied to reflect non-simulated peaks, or are you assuming all load peaks together?
When we do the ELCC and the loss of load analyses, we look at it on an hourly basis. So we look at all of the load on an hourly basis. So we're not doing it just on like a CP basis.
Okay.
We're looking at it just like on a literally on an 8760 basis.
Okay, I gotcha. Okay, yeah, that's useful for us. I think, I just, these are important questions to ask because, we want to make sure that we're not oversimplifying, um, assuming full coincidence or that it accounts for real world, diversity and load patterns. So yeah, I wanted clarity on, where we're assessing whether generation can actually cover demand. And so, those are kind of where my questions are centered. So, for instance, I'm interested in where El Paso Electric will apportion power to itself from its Texas jurisdiction when, if those if your PRM falls short of what operational realities you experience.
So, Autumn, maybe just to kind of break those components down just real quickly. When you talk about falling short of the plan and reserve margin requirement, are you talking about, for all of your questions, are you looking into the future? You're looking at, 26 and beyond and not the current operational year?
Yeah, so I mean, both, I suppose. So we're looking at 2020. Let's take 2025 well, I guess it hasn't happened yet. I guess to make things easier, I suppose we should look at the 2024, right? And understand, what did you apportion in your PRM, and did you did you meet difficulties? It sounds like you did. There were some difficulties there in meeting your in generating, having generation for your load. So I'm interested in understanding what you all foresee this year and how that changes. I'm seeing that, in every future year, you've got a PRM shortfall. So what I'd like to understand is is that coming from Texas? Is EPE planning on doing, either wheeling to itself or doing self-dealing? That's what I'd like to understand.
It's
Emmanuel, did you
Go
want to
ahead.
take the first step of that?
So I think first, taking a step back, there is no self-dealing or movement of capacity between Texas and New Mexico because our system is dispatched as a whole. So it's just in the operational view and in real world application, it's one system. But if you break it down jurisdictionally, there is a shortage in Texas and a shortage in New Mexico.
Right. So, I think you said, where are we sitting at, 7% or something like that, somewhere around there in the PRM?
On the reserve margin?
Yeah. Is that, what I'd like to understand is, you've got these thermal generation units that you're retiring. They're 70, 80 years old. When you retire those units and start pulling on solar and BESS, you're losing some of your spinning reserve, and that happens over time. The more and more that those thermal generations units go away, that spinning reserve comes from Texas, no?
There are spinning reserves in both states, New Mexico still has some gas generation.
So, Orland, it does raise an interesting question. It's a case of inertia and then also spinning reserves, right? So if we talk about just the capability to ramp up to meet load, then as New Mexico transitions more towards battery energy storage, batteries are essentially instantaneous, right? So you can use batteries to ramp up, ramp down to meet load within the limitations of their duration.
Right.
When you start looking at more technical components, such as inertia, and you start looking at the need for voltage support, then you start having to look at, okay, what's the solution when you're looking at inverter-based technologies? And you can start looking at capacitor banks, synchronous condensers, and those sort of technologies. Right now, those aren't necessarily included in the IRP, but may become a bigger component as you start going through this transition.
Right. Yeah. So, on a time scale, we may be talking about 20, 30 years down the line. Are those communicated anywhere in the IRP? Are those, is that anywhere in the IRP that, as we go away from our thermal generation units in New Mexico, we may have to apportion for those things, synchronous condensers and stat comms and all that stuff. I mean, because I assume they're not anything I can afford.
Emmanuel, I don't think they were in your last IRP, but please correct me.
I honestly can't remember. I wasn't a part of the last IRP.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I appreciate that you all are coming with this, this clarity. I think it's important to, I actually, in the loads and resources tables, if you scroll to the bottom there, you've got some, this is where I see granularity that helps me. In your little outside the table, you've got some granularity that explains where your ELCCs are, what solar PPAs, you'll be, let's see, existing renewable solar PPAs. Those are important for I believe, both PRC staff and ratepayers to understand. I wonder if you can go through those a little bit, Mr. Elsey.
Sure, and I may, just because this is the operational view, in Rhonda, if you do have the longer term, the 26 through 45 LNR table available, it might be a little bit easier, just in case I'm contradicting these numbers slightly. When I talk it through, Orland, I'll go through maybe a slightly higher level, and then we can drill into the specifics, the actual numbers in a moment.
Sure, thank you.
But maybe before I do, are you broadly familiar with how ELCC works, or would you like me to kind of maybe start from the beginning here?
I am. I think it would be helpful, however, since this is a recorded session, it may be helpful to go through kind of a high level view of that. The way I look at ELCCs is almost like a backpack carrying books. It's your effective capacity of carrying your load, which may be your books. So I guess you could, I know that may be a kindergarten way of looking at things, but that's kind of how I go from the 100,000-foot view.
Okay, no, perfect. Let me just maybe just give you some kind of background here, and then we can get into the details. So when we talk about effective load carrying capability, typically what we're talking about is how much additional load can a resource carry while still maintaining the same reliability metrics, right? So at the moment, we've talked about this in the meeting down in Las Cruces. EP are currently serving or working to a 0.2 loss of load probability and they're going to increase that to a 0.1 loss of load probability by the end of the decade. So what we essentially do, let's say we're trying to work out the ELCC value of solar. We will run the portfolio with all of the additional resources, excluding the solar generation. And we will say, how much load can we serve while maintaining a 0.2 or a 0.1 loss of load probability? And let's just, for ease of numbers, say that's 100 megawatts. This portfolio of resources can serve 100 megawatts of load and maintain that reliability metric. And then we say, okay, let's add solar to the portfolio. And we say, let's add 10 megawatts of solar on top of the portfolio. Now we reevaluate and we say, okay, how much total load can the system now serve while maintaining that 0.1 reliability metric? And let's say now that 10 megawatts of solar addition allows you to serve 105 megawatts of load. So by adding the solar, you've gone from serving 100 megawatts to 105 megawatts, and you've added 10 megawatts of solar. The ELCC of that solar would be 50% because you're adding 10 megawatts of solar and you can serve 5 megawatts of additional load. So really, that's what you do for each technology. You essentially study the portfolio without the technology. You add a amount of a resource type on top. You see how much additional load it can serve, and that would be its ELCC value. Now, the ELCC values are dynamic in a couple of functions. One is they tend to decline over time, certainly for storage and intermittent resources, as your penetration of those resources increase. So let's just say in that example, you added 5 megawatts or 10 megawatts, of solar, and it gave you 50% accreditation. It could carry 5 megawatts of additional load. As the penetration increases, what you're essentially doing is you're shifting the loss of load hours, or the hours where the system would likely have reliability, later and later in the day. So you may go to 7 p.m., 8 p.m., 9 p.m. So there's a diminishing value as you continue to add solar to the system. So typically with ELCCs, and I can send you some graphs separately, as the penetration increases, its value decreases. And you see that particularly with solar. You also see it with storage for a different reason. With storage, then let's talk 4-hour storage. As the penetration of storage increases, you're starting to take the low-hanging fruit. So you're really taking off those very peaky hours on the system. But once you get past a certain amount, you find yourself a pretty flat load profile, right? So you're not really shaving much of the peak off anymore. So there becomes a diminishing value for storage. They're also dynamic in a second way, and this is why we call them services, is they are dependent upon the other resources in the portfolio. So as penetration of solar increases, if you're combining it with storage, you have a correlated effect where the loss of load hours are being pushed into the early evening and later in the evening with the solar, but the storage provides the value where it can charge and discharge in those hours where you have loss of load. So solar and storage is an example of a positive correlation. Those two work in tangent and help each other out. There are negative dynamic relationships. For example, demand response in storage. Those two technologies essentially do the same thing. They essentially shave the peak. So if you had a system that had high demand response penetration that could already shave the peak, the value of storage would be less because you're having less value to it. It's already further down the stack. So that's kind of the relationship between the two. So we do those studies for each technology type, including natural gas. And we provide ELCC forecasts for companies like EP to use. So we say, this is the value of solar on an ELCC basis, and here is how it changes over time as penetration increases. And here is a third layer to the service. Here is how it changes as you add other technologies such as storage. Now, that's a pretty complex process to describe without having charts and graphs in front of me. But Orland, does that kind of make sense?
That's very helpful, and I think I think this is useful because it's helpful for us to understand how how the system operates in a way that load peaks are being addressed with your solar and storage. And with another question that comes to mind is if the load peaks are being addressed with your solar and storage, that taxes your system less. So there's a deferment of investment necessity at substations and et cetera. But how do you all quantify that? How do you all that my question is that how do you quantify your investment deferments? How do you say we're going to save $100 million or more? How, that much I'd like to understand is how do you communicate, hey, this isn't we're not thermally loading our lines or to the degree that we would otherwise.
Okay, and that is a great question. And I get to talk a little bit here about IRPs versus ISPs. So historically, when you look at those deferred decisions, generation was very much siloed on its own. So when you do these analyses and you say, hey, I can defer build-in peaking capacity, you were really just looking at those deferred costs on a generation basis. How much avoided capital is there? So how many CTs can I avoid building? And then what are my energy benefits? So if I'm pushing load later in the day, how much does it cost, excuse me, to serve that load compared to if I had the same load during peak hours when energy prices were higher? So historically, that question, Orland, was pretty much just looked at on a generation perspective. Now, transmission kind of crept in just a little bit because you would typically have interconnection costs and transmission network upgrade costs assigned to those generators. So you would say, hey, if it cost me $200 million to build a CT, maybe it actually costs $250 million to build the CT, the generation tie line, and then some transmission network upgrades. And you would avoid those costs. But you were still pretty much focused on the generator and the direct transmission that was assigned to it. Where EP are headed, and quite frankly, where the industry is heading, is more into a integrated system plan. Now, the first step that EP are taking, which many utilities are taking right now, is to start looking more granularly at the bulk transmission system. So they're trying to co-optimize the generation and the transmission system together. So all of the costs, avoided costs I've just described, are still captured. But also what you're trying to answer is, okay, if I was to build this generator in this geographical location versus a different geographical location, what is the impact on avoided bulk transmission? And then what is the impact on a congestion basis? So you're also capturing congestion, locational marginal prices, and then also avoided transmission. Where we still don't get too low, any utility across the nation right now, is on that more granular basis when you start looking node low. So you start looking at your 115, your 69 kV lines, and you start looking at your distribution system. That would be kind of the next step in this evolution towards an ISP. So where we are today and in this IRP is really the G&T function. And then at some point going forward, you'll see utilities transitioning to also capture some of the smaller transmission and distribution avoided costs. Did I answer your question there,
Yes.
Orland?
Yeah, that's great. And I think I'd like to know, how long I suppose you can run several models, right? Depending on whichever granularity you select. So at this juncture, do you all have do you have any rough base cases? Do you have anything that for 2025 that you all have done, or is that still in the works?
I think the hope is to have the first kind of base case modeling subject to some QA, QC, some check-in, in that kind of April to May sort of time frame. So it's not quite ready yet, but it is pretty close.
Okay. Okay, and then when you get a base case, then at that time you run your model again with higher granularity, I would assume.
So the hope here is the base case will include kind of that generation and transmission co-optimization. So we'll get to the G&T function. And what we spoke about this morning with the demand side management team is we're still in this IRP or this ISP, we are not going to be able to get down to like the distribution type level. So what we can do is do like proxy adjustments to costs. And the example I gave this morning is, let's just say for argument's sake, a distribution connected battery costs $100 a kW year. Through kind of standalone separate studies, analyses, calculations, you could determine that the value of avoided distribution would be $10 a kW year. So for our modeling, we could model the net cost of that distribution battery as 100 minus 10, $90 a kW year. So that's kind of the interim step utilities, not just EPs, but utilities nationwide are taking, where they kind of co-optimize G&T, and for now, avoided distribution in smaller scale transmission has to be done as an adjustment to the cost assumptions. And that's just purely done, Orland, because the models and the technology just doesn't exist where you can do multi-year capacity expansion modeling on a nodal hourly or sub-hourly basis.
Okay. Yeah, that is helpful. So, I think I've got all of my questions so far for this office hour answered. Thanks for diving in so deep, so quick. And I think, thank you, Ben. I appreciate that. I'd like to kind of turn it over to Cynthia if she's got some specific questions. I definitely want to dive into those as I think it's important. I think from the standpoint of El Paso Electric, you can quickly see how the PRC comes to you and says, "Bring us a rock," and you say, "Well, what rock? What color? How big? How small?" If I ask you, what is your operational reality and what are your operational constraints? Your answer is 1,000 pages long or more. And so, from the PRC standpoint, what we're interested in is providing as much clarity to our ratepayers as possible. I'm aware that El Paso Electric has provided us with reliable electricity for decades. However, now we're kind of changing how we're doing our generation. So investment changes majorly, and our and so do our reliability metrics, and how we evaluate those things. So I'd like to kind of give Cynthia the floor a little bit, because I think she's got I think decades of experience in IRPs across the nation. So I'm interested in her take and her questions. And really what we're looking for our ratepayers is assurance that we're not overbuilding to a degree that's going to hurt us in the future, but that we're maintaining our system reliability.
That makes sense. And Orland, just before you hand it over to Cynthia, maybe just a real high level comment in return here is I think, great comments, very valid concerns. I think it's extremely important as we go into IRP processes, not just for EP, but again, nationwide, is to really look at scenario and sensitivity development, right? So there is no way EP are going to get their load forecast exactly correct. There's no way Excel or PNM are going to get their load forecast exactly correct. But understanding what is the least regrets expansion plan or least regrets capital investment that can be made under a range of scenarios is kind of how you can address that without, putting burdensome pressure on customers and ratepayers. So like what we typically do on IRPs is we look out the 20, 25, 30-year planning horizon. And as you look over that period, the plans get wider and wider apart, right? As uncertainty increases. But that first 3 to 5 years in New Mexico was very clever in the fact that, the action plan is a short-term view. You can identify commonalities between those scenarios and say, okay, even if load growth over time diverges significantly, what's the least regrets decisions you can make now in the next 3 years? Act upon those decisions, and then make sure the utility is ready to pivot when they follow their next IRP.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Elsey. Appreciate that.
Before we move on, can I just make one small clarification about your comment earlier, Mr. Whitney, about the results that we're gonna have later on? You said it was you would like to see results for 2025. Our planning horizon in the our resource optimization model starts in 2026. So we'll have results from 2026 on.
Thank you, Rhonda.
You're welcome.
Ben, it's always such a treat for me to spend any time with you in the IRP space because I learned so much. So thank you.
Likewise. Thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Well, and I'm sorry to have missed you in Las Cruces. I had a question about the load forecast. I know you have the loads and resources table posted, which I haven't looked at. I'm excited to look at that. And when you have at the bottom of the table the system demand, you essentially show what you call your out of model adjustments, the DG and EE and EV, and then the new large customers. And one piece I'm interested in seeing is what was then actually the detailed load forecast as you had in your last IRP. That was the attachment B, where you had the load forecast by jurisdiction, system, and New Mexico energy and demand. And I assume, that it's either being created or is done. And I know it's something that you'll file with part of the plan, but I really enjoyed looking at the 24 or the last load forecast and seeing that there really was what I want to say, it was rather constant, the growth rates between New Mexico and system as a whole, and then also the customer categories. There was a steadiness, and so interested in looking at how some of that volatility that you speak of with the large loads and extreme weather is actually being captured in the forecast going forward. That's one matter I was interested in. And then going back to Orland's discussion with you about where generation can cover demand and being able to get into the granularity of that. And this goes back to one of your slide decks. It was February 11th, and it was slide 29, where you showed the 2024 summer peak day load and resources. And my goodness, you had significant forced outages and ended up purchasing 575 megawatts of power. Did the group discuss that in any more detail at the March 11th workshop?
Not in any of the discussions I was in. Judy and Manuel, did you discuss that any further in the modeling group at all?
No, we didn't discuss that in any more detail. And Cynthia, yeah, the purpose of that was just to kind of show the system and where we were as of right now, and as just kind of a base going into the discussions that we were going to transition into with discussing resource planning.
Right, right. And so I guess looking forward just to summer of 25, um, I was curious as to why those units had forced outage, and were derated to begin with on what turned out to be the summer peak day. And then on that purchase of 575, that's quite significant for a system that on that peak day you were under 2400 on your system peak. And this isn't, I guess, and I wanted to say, Ben, for possible consideration on the demand side, it seems that maybe the cost of that purchase power might be a potential benchmark of one upper limit of cost that we could test at least some amount of demand response, at least for the New Mexico system against. And then just going forward, what will be your assumptions and analytic basis for cost and availability of purchases on a regional basis? And as you know, the Southwest is just going to heat up more, and utilities in the Southwest, as around the country, are capacity constrained, capacity tight, bringing on resources as fast as they can. And that is, this matter is something that I've talked with Ed Realcoff a little bit about. So anything you can do now to address that would be helpful. And then I'd like to continue to have that dialogue with you.
Yeah, so let me start with the historical performance during the 24 peak, and I'm going to provide some very high level commentary that is not necessarily EP specific, just because I don't work for the company. Then I'll pass it over to Emmanuel, and then we can come back to the market price forecast and the market availability. So my kind of high level comment just here real quickly is, Cynthia, I think you said EP's peak in 2024 was somewhere in the region of 2,400 megawatts.
Was 20, they say 2316.
Okay.
The peak day of 6:25 between 4 and 6 p.m.
And kind of my observation here is that aligns with kind of the load forecast that was shown on the LNR table just a moment ago.
Yeah.
So it was my understanding that EP have updated their load forecast to reflect what happened in 2024, and that
Sure.
is somewhat driving the need for some additional resources. So my perspective is they was a little bit short in that year. But Emmanuel, like, please jump in here and disagree with me.
I would never dare.
So I think maybe, Cynthia, just to say that I think EP acknowledged that, you know, they potentially were short during calendar year 24 and have gone, you know, and addressed the issue by trying to procure new resources. And I can't speak for where they are in those processes in each state. But Emmanuel, Judy, if you want to jump into your most recent RFPs or where you're at, please do.
It'll help me direct the answer. What exactly is the question again? Are we trying to get to?
Well, I'm just trying to understand how you ended up in a situation with the Newman units and New Gardner on forced outage, and then more Newman units and the copper unit derated for the day. And not being an engineer, my understanding is that there is, you know, effective capacities, and they can be applied to renewables as well as thermal units. But then there can be critical situations with thermal units, particularly in peak heat conditions where they get further derated from what would be their otherwise forced outage or effective capacity.
So that can happen. It would depend on the age of the unit, the technology, and the geographical location. So,
Right.
for
Well,
example,
these are old resources. I mean, yeah, and it not that they can happen, but it did happen in this instance.
yeah, they did. So again, the question you're trying to get to is how did we wind up with all of these D rates?
Yeah. This seems fairly significant that then you had to go out and purchase 575 megawatts of power. And of course, I have a strong background and interest in practice in demand side resources. And so I see something like this and I think, my gosh, this looks like a perfect opportunity to really lean in on demand side resources, particularly given the great situation you're in now with your AMI meters almost at 100%.
So there's a lot of caveats there, right? So demand side management is great, but you're not going to have a DSM project that will span, the 600-700 megawatts of generation you see there on the
Right,
screen,
right.
right?
I'm not
Uh,
expecting that.
So the company takes all of its summer prep outages and all of that in the shoulder months to be ready for the summer.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, they do. Like that's everything centers around meeting the summer peak. So most transmission outages, all generation outages, everything is done on the shoulder months where we have the most flexibility to be prepared for the summer. But it's, always be prepared for the worst. But so none of this is scheduled, right? But you're talking about running, these are gigantic engines the size of buildings, and you're running them 24/7 in 110-degree heat or 100-degree heat for
Or
days and days
more.
on end. It is just a mechanical reality that
Okay.
something can fail. It might not, but it can. And that's why you have these reserve requirements built in and these other types of projects is to try to account for that invariability.
Well,
And
so,
Cynthia, I'm just
oh, go ahead.
sorry, just to jump in just real quickly. So to Emmanuel's point, that is a reality, right? Mechanical engines are going to fail. And that's why we look at what EP are doing when they're using ELCC for all. So when we do ELCC values for thermal generation, we're capturing these forced outage rates, right? So a gas generator does not get 100% reliability contribution like they historically did for these very reasons that they do have forced outages, sometimes when you need them.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess to Orland's questions too, and help me out with this, Orland. I'm trying to understand the 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 statement that now we are including forced outage rates, in our thermal units as part of the ELCC calculation. But then how do you still end up in a situation where you have your units like you did on this peak day with so much forced outage? And I know you dipped into your reserve margin quite a bit, but you still had to go out and purchase a good chunk of capacity of power.
Yeah,
And
without
guess one
stealing,
question I had too was just if I could, I'm interested in the duration of this purchase. Did you just need this power for, a few hours, or was it for did you get yourself into a 12-hour period and continue the purchase the next day and that sort of thing? And Orlin, if I'm getting way out of bounds, please let me know.
no, I think, okay, so I think these are all clarity questions and I think that's acceptable. But I think, one thing that I think, can be said about, the I'll just go back to the PRM because, El Paso Electric, they're at 7% PRM and they've got these forced outages, that are somewhat sporadic. It's almost like I think about it as an accelerator and a clutch, right? You have to I'd say it can be argued that El Paso Electric is perhaps maybe the most in step with their community in New Mexico because what they're doing is their PRM is sure they're low, but and all of this is unforeseen. Nobody has a crystal ball. El Paso Electric tries with their you try they try with their crystal ball in their modeling. But I think with if we were seeing something like a 15% PRM, that's overbuilding, right? You're apportioning yourself so much generation, so that you won't run into issues in the future, and perhaps you'd run into less. But I believe they've got complex calculations in their Aurora models that they've evaluated whether or not, when those things make the most sense, because they're financially interested in their investments working out, and so are their stakeholders. So and so I think that's where I see it. But I think Mr. Elsie may be able to may be able to clarify better than me.
There's
Sorry, Manuel, go ahead.
no. I think I'm not too sure what you're gonna hit on, Ben, but I think there's a disconnect between I think it's a success, the fact that we took into consideration the PRMs that we did and the forced outages that happened, and we were still able to meet load. Um, it's not a failing in saying that you took into account the ELCCs and you still had forced outages. We
Right.
take into account the ELCCs to prepare in case these forced outages happen. And yeah, to that earlier comment, forced outages are sporadic because they just happen. It's not a planned outage, right? Where you're actively thinking about when is the best time to bring a unit on. It's when something fails or goes wrong. It's the equivalent of why do you buy insurance if you're never going to use it? Because the day that you're going to need it, it's there. To that earlier comment on the crystal ball, and we're very good at what we do. You don't, not to toot our own horn, but you don't see a lot of 1950s, 1960s vehicles being driven on the road right now, much less driving cross country. The fact that EPE is able to support a system this size on generation that old, on technology that old, I think it's a testament to the folks at the plants and the engineers that are able to keep the lights on with the limited resources that they have. But like all good things, it's going to come to an end at some point, and we need to be proactive in taking off this older generation and replacing it with newer, more reliable, more efficient generation. You want to take these units out before they take themselves out, basically.
No, I really appreciate that. And I know Margie's off mute, so we're getting ready to wrap up. But I just wanted to say quickly that I would, that Ed did discuss with me looking at the market price forecast and availability. So we'll be looking for that sooner than later. And then I did have a request. I wanted to see a top 100 hour load duration curve. So we have our peak, and I want to see how quickly that peak falls off.
Yeah,
And-
so Cynthia, there were a number of things that you articulated in the Thursday's workshop. We have at least we captured your notes in that. This was not on that list. We can forward that to EPE and E3. Judy, I don't know if that's something that's already incorporated into the data on the SharePoint site, but we can add that, Cynthia, as a request for information.
Okay. Do you need anything else from me on that?
Go ahead, Ben.
Just one question, Cynthia. I just want to clarify. When you asked for the top 100 hours load duration curve, would it be more valuable to provide the net load duration curve, so net of renewable production?
Can we see?
I believe that would be very useful, Ben. So I think that would help us. Yeah, I think that's, yeah, I think that's useful.
Okay.
Ben, can you restate what that is, please?
Yeah, so rather than provide, or I mean, it's easy to provide both. It's not hard, but rather than just providing the top 100 gross load hours, we would also provide the top 100 net load hours. So
Yeah.
load less renewable production during that given hour.
Yeah, no, that's perfect.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I know we're at the end of our hour, so I wanted to thank you.
Quick question. This is Judy Amer.
Go ahead, Judy.
Well, everyone is aware, because it was highly publicized, that the governor and I don't remember the name of the company, but announced that there was going to be this high load AI facility located in EPE's territory. And is there going to be anything in this IRP that anticipates that load and talks about what resources are going to be procured to support that?
And you want to hit that first?
Judy, or
Yeah, please do.
go ahead, Emmanuel. Sorry, I put.
No. I suppose it depends on which one you're talking about, because we have had a lot of interest from a lot of different entities. There has been some more structured interest for some projects in Texas and some in New Mexico.
I'm referring to the one recently that the governor had a press conference.
That's the Borderplex announcement, Judy.
Yeah,
and
right.
and I'll just jump in because I think we can cut to the in the modeling form, and we explained this at the meeting in Las Cruces. The EPE baseline, and Ben or Emmanuel, correct me if I'm wrong, includes large load customers for which we have for which we've entered into contracts. So that includes the Borderplex, which is 80 megawatts, I believe. And what is the other large load customer that's included in our baseline?
All right, thank you.
Great. And Judy, I'll add to that, there's a lot of conversation amongst the stakeholders about looking at data centers in addition to those as possible large loads and the pros and cons of that. So that is being discussed by stakeholders with the EPE team.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Margie.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
I know we're at time. Do we have 2 more minutes? Because I just want to address one comment. But if we need to cut you off, please do.
No, you all EPE E3, this is your time. So do what you need to. I just wanted to call attention to our commitment.
Okay, I was just hearing comments from Orland and then Cynthia, and kind of this is starting to make sense to me. So I just want to maybe decompartmentalize the 2024 actuals with what we're doing on a planning perspective, right? So from a planning perspective, and a planning perspective only, if we look at what happened in 2024, first and foremost, the load forecast has been updated since the 2024 time period. So the load forecast sits higher even without the data center load. Secondly, we try and account for thermal generation outages and then also just the intermittent nature of renewable resources within the ELCC values. And then on top of that, we have a planning reserve margin requirement. Now, just to be clear, the planning reserve margin requirement is 9 to 10%. It's slightly lower in 25 on the operational view. So we have a 9 to 10% planning reserve margin on top, which accounts for additional weather variability and then some outages maybe that we didn't capture in the ELCC. Now, typically for the purposes of purchasing capacity, we generally do not assume that EPE can buy capacity to solve their resource need from a planning perspective. So those market price or those market purchases that you saw occurred in 2024, we don't typically have them for planning purposes other than for economic energy, but we typically don't have EPE rely on the market to meet their capacity needs. So that's a planning perspective. Now, in reality, obviously there is a market there and EP can purchase from the market as kind of a provider of last resort for capacity reasons. So I don't think we want to plan to buy from the market, but in the real world, if those options are there, then that may still be the lowest cost and most sensible solution for EP. So just want to draw distinctions between the two.
May I also add to that point, Ben, that in our LNR, we do not assume market purchases as well.
And I think Emmanuel touched upon this in maybe the second and the third meetings, is we look at kind of the 20-year planning horizon of the IRP. We've really broke it down into 3 time periods, right? Years 1 to 3, years 4 to 10, and then 11 to 20. It really is you're planning for like the first 3 years. It's really hard to bring new resources online. So you're really working within the constraints of your existing fleet. So that's why, companies like EPE will make the decision to go and buy from the market to do short-term purchases in order to solve a short-term need because they can't get steel in the ground quick enough. But on a longer-term planning horizon, you should be looking at capital, steel in the ground to solve those issues. Or Cynthia, to your point, additional programs for demand-side management.
Yep.
Sorry, Marge, you had to get that out.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mr. LC. Let me ask Emmanuel, when was the last time El Paso Electric experienced a catastrophic failure in one of their generating facilities?
I don't recall. Been a while. That's a good thing.
I'd say so. All right, thanks. Thanks, folks. I think I'm out of questions.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for participating in this conversation. Thank you for the PRC Utility Division staff for posing some great questions, and to EPE3 for your quick and accurate responses. So with that, we'll say adieu and look forward to seeing you all at the workshop by Zoom on April 23rd. So thank you so much, and we will post the recording from this session onto the EPE website in case some of our other stakeholders can take advantage of the knowledge that you all have exchanged today. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.